Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Zaidema, and I am the administrator for the Phoenix Chamber Choir. We're going to get started today, and I will continue letting participants in as we continue on with our webinar. A couple of housekeeping items. As I mentioned before, please make sure that your video and audio remain off during the webinar so that we can make sure that we can see and hear our panelists clearly. If you have any questions during the webinar for the panelists, please put them in the chat where everyone can see, and there will be a question and answer portion at the end of our time, and I'll be taking notes on what's been brought up in the chat, and we can pass those on to our panelists. If you have technical difficulties or any questions for me personally, please find my name in the chat and just message me one-on-one, and I'll do my very best to help you out. I'm just going to be here for the beginning of the video and then pass it over to my amazing colleague, Dr. Nicholle Andrews, to take it all over from here. But I'd like to introduce you a little bit to our panelists today. First, we have Frédéricka. Frédéricka is an incredible soprano, a teacher, a performer living and working in Montreal, and we are so excited to have her with us. We have Leela, who is the inaugural Director of Human Rights and Equity at Brock University in Ontario. Wonderful to have you here, Leela. We have Andre. Andre is a composer, newly appointed to the faculty at Redlands University, where Nicholle Andrews works as well. And Floydd. Floydd is artistic director, a conductor, an incredible musician living and working in Montreal right now. So we have a wonderful array of panelists, and their full bios are on our website. So please do take time to read through those in detail. Our webinar today will be facilitated by Nicholle Andrews, who is, of course, the artistic director of the Phoenix Chamber Choir. She is also the director of choral studies at University of Redlands in California. And she has brought together this panel today. So thank you very much, Dr. Andrews. And I'm going to pass it over to you to begin our time together today.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's a pleasure to have my colleagues here with me today, and I know we all want to hear what they have to say, so we're going to jump right in and share our questions that we have come up with over the past few weeks of meeting together. We're going to start with Andre. Can you tell us why this conversation is so important and critical at this point in time? Oh, one sec, you have to unmute.
Unmute. Yeah, there I am. Okay. So yes, thanks, Nicholle. I appreciate the question. I appreciate the invitation. It's an interesting question. It's an important and urgent question, obviously. And it's a question actually that I'd like to pass on to all the participants when we leave here today, for us to consider what it is that brings us to questions about the intersection of music and racial justice. It's of paramount importance. I want to enter full screen here, sorry. All right, so one thing that we know for certain is that we find ourselves in a very politically fraught moment right now, thinking about the deaths of police violence from George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. So perhaps you find yourselves angry or disgusted or disillusioned at this most recent flare-up of violence. I know it's been a challenging time for me and for many others, African American and otherwise. So this particular moment calls up an urgency for an issue that is a generational issue, right? This is one that has been with us for generations and one that will be with us after we're gone. The plight of racialized justice or racial justice is a generational problem. And while we may feel a particular urgency to address some of the lives that are at stake right now, my hope is that this begins a conversation that allows us to bring our intention into a stream that has already been at a stream of activity that has already been at work for many years and will continue long after us. So, you know, perhaps you find yourself, you're a choir director and you're looking to diversify your repertoire, or you're singing in a choir and you're looking for ways of welcoming voices in the African diaspora into your community. Or perhaps you're just a lover of justice and are interested in finding ways of being a good ally. All of these are laudable goals and really important to addressing the urgency and the importance of our particular moment. But we must first recognize that urgency and importance are not the same, right? So urgency is is redress around a particular set of issues, however you may define them. And importance is a longer term project, right? So if urgency is the spark, then importance is the fire that burns constantly. And so this urgent moment may inspire a spark of action towards a particular moment within us and within our culture. But my hope also is that it finds a way of inspiring a larger action. So I'd ask, before we begin thinking about how, actionable goals towards bringing voices from the African diasporic community into our communities, into our community choirs, that we first allow ourselves just to bear witness to the challenging nature of our times, the seemingly insurmountable weight of racial oppression, and the history that all of us carry within us, and pass on to our posterity, and find ways of recognizing that we don't need to do things the way that they've done, the way that they were done onto us, or the way that they've been done before. We have agency now. We can change things. We can change the way the conversation moves forward around Black people. We can change the way conversation happens around African diasporic voices within Canadian choral music. We can change the way we sing. We could change the type of music we sing. We could change the people with whom we sing. We can add to our beloved community, that Kingian notion of beloved community. And so my hope is that this is one step in a much longer race, journey, shall we say, of healing and of reconciliation that my country, the United States, has not yet really fully come to terms with. But we all know that music and arts generally are about kind of a truth and reconciliation, and finding ways of telling truths that might otherwise be too hard to hear. So let's first bear witness to where we're at, and then find the courage and fortitude to respond in an authentic way. So I would argue that, well, I can only speak for myself because all of us are here for different reasons, but I would argue that I'm here because I'm interested in learning and listening about how we as singers, as choir directors, as musicians, can find ways of welcoming authentically African diasporic voices within our community, whether it be repertoire, whether it be community members, whether it be just through an awareness that others are out there and a part of, and to find ways of including them into our notion of King's beloved community. So that for me is the place to start. Allow yourself to listen, allow yourself to learn, and hopefully from there, a good set of actionable goals can emerge.
Wow, thank you so much, Andre. Any other panelists want to reflect on what Andre just shared with us, or just don't forget to unmute yourself?
I just really think that the idea of allyship is just so important right now, and I really thank Andre. I thank you for bringing that up, because there are so many more steps that we can take in this arena, in this quest to bring more diversity and more inclusion into the fold. And I think that the more people that we have with that type of mindset, trying to bring us to a new era of music making, I think that that is probably one of the most important points that we can talk about today. And so to that end, I'd like to thank everyone that's here for being here and for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Floyd. Yes, Leela.
I think the notion of allyship is one that's very interesting, and thinking about what Andre had to say. I'm speaking to you from the Niagara Peninsula in Ontario, land covered by the Dish with One Spoon wampum, as well as the Tuwa wampum. And I've been reflecting, I reflect on that a lot, on what it means to be a settler on territory that has been governed by a treaty that goes back over 1,000 years. And how should that affect everything I do, even when I may not make the connections for myself. And so part of my reason, I think, for being here and why this is important is I am not a musician. I love music, but that's not my world. But the fact that I can engage in these conversations and be an ally to the community is something that I've actually realized through our conversations is something really important for others. I wouldn't have given myself any credit, because I would have said one has to be a musician at a very high level to engage in dialogue about these issues of justice. And I've come to understand there's a place for just having the conversations. And the last thing I'll say in response to what Andre said was the other thing, Niagara is known for Niagara Falls, of course, but it's also where Harriet Tubman and Underground Railroad ended here in Niagara. And it's something that we in this area don't always think about as to what that means, what it means in terms of the hundreds of years in which Black Canadians have lived here, and what we could have been doing throughout that time. It's wonderful that we're beginning now, but there's been a history which we also can't forget when we think about what's important in the country as we move towards conversations around reconciliation and decolonization. And some of those, having those conversations is the reason that I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you, Leela. Fred, did you want to share anything before we moved on to our next question?
Sure. Thanks, Nicholle. I'm very grateful to be here today. Andre, I really appreciated you touching on the idea of having the courage to respond. And in these times that we live in, part of the legitimate concern is, am I going to say the wrong thing? Am I going to get this right? I think I understand, but do I truly understand? And you might find yourself somewhere in that spectrum, but it's okay. And we have to allow ourselves the opportunity to journey personally through these types of questions. And that takes courage. If you're a choral director, it's going to take courage to ask yourself, hey, I've never even thought about programming music that reflects the African diaspora voices. Or I sing in a choir and there isn't a single person here that belongs to an unrepresented community. Or I run a program in a higher education facility and we've never really paused to think about what this means for us. So having the courage to ask the questions is where we begin. We bear witness, and then, which is, looking outwards, and then we look inwards to ourselves and say, where do I fit in, and what does this look like for me? So thank you, Andre, for pointing that out and encouraging us to have the courage to respond.
Thank you, Frédéricka. That was wonderful. I had a question, if I could turn my sound up. I hope this is a little bit better now, that if I'm a little bit louder for my questions. Leela, I want to move on to you. Choirs are kind of little micro communities onto ourselves, and we have these pockets of communities all over the world. And we're generally drawn together for a love of music or for other reasons in some cases, whether it be a style of music or who knows. And right now, many of us are struggling on how to move forward in a digital age. How do we rehearse? What can we bring that may not be just singing online, that can still keep our community together? And one thing I find in our field, we often hear the term safe space, that our ensembles are a safe space for people within the community and within our ensemble. But I've also heard you reference a brave space, and I don't think that's common in our community. And I'm hoping you can share with us the difference between a safe space and a brave space, and how choirs can facilitate conversations moving forward online with their ensembles this coming season.
It's a really interesting question, because I think for a long time we were part of groups and we often assume that they're safe spaces. So we say, we're a safe space, and nobody says we're not, so we must be. We sort of define ourselves as safe spaces based on whatever characteristics it might be, the love of music, the type of music, we live in this part of town, and we come together. And over time, and this notion of brave spaces, I mean, I'm sure it's come up in all sorts of areas, but in higher education in particular, it began to come up because people defined safe spaces. Often they were physical spaces. They were centers for marginalized students or marginalized faculty and staff. And people said these are safe spaces. And nobody ever really asked much about what makes it safe. Is it really safe for everybody? And then the questions started to come up about, is it really safe for everybody? If so, who? And then if it's very safe, do we engage in some of these conversations that Fred talked about in terms of the courage to have some of these conversations? And the answer increasingly seemed no, we're not having those conversations in some of these safe spaces. And so people started to say, well, okay, so safe space is really ambiguous. It's really to do with, it's in the eye of the beholder. You've said it's a safe space, you've deemed it a safe space, whether or not the people in it actually feel so. Because realistically, who's likely to challenge it? If you're not feeling safe in a space, you're the least likely person to say, this is not a place that's good for me. So the idea of a brave space came up, and it was to say that you'd probably need to make a distinction. There's a safe space where people are together and they're happy where they are and they've checked in, and yes, everyone seems to feel like they're really safe. But then to say, what conversations don't happen in this space? Perhaps we never venture into this area, or I've noticed we never actually talk about this. When we go here, we veer off into another direction. So the idea of brave space was one initially where there were 5 elements that were sort of present, people said. The first was controversy with civility. So we accept varying opinions, very divergent opinions. We own intentions and impacts. So we acknowledge, we discuss instances where the dialogue of the group has affected the well-being of someone else. The notion, which is very well known in sort of student affairs circles in higher education, of challenge by choice, where individuals have the chance to step in and step out of challenging conversations. We're not forcing someone to be there. Respect for one another, an agreement and an agreement not to intentionally inflict harm on one another. And that was said, the word intentionally was there for a reason. In those difficult conversations, we may harm one another by the simple usage of a word or a term. We did not do it intentionally. We're doing it to have a conversation. And so the brave space was, okay, let's have an environment in which we can talk about race, in which we can discuss the fact that our choir very rarely manages to bring in Black Canadians, and if we do, they don't stay with us, for example. You're going to have a deep conversation about what that means. And you can't promise people something that people often want, which is that it's a comfortable space. So that's something very different. A brave space may be an incredibly uncomfortable space to be able to have that real conversation. And then at the same time, some people, maybe there were the people who brought those individuals into the choir and know exactly why they left. And they're going to probably need support if you want them to tell you the truth of why somebody left. What tools do you provide to them? And so it's the idea is provide the tools that you're enhancing the conversation so that everybody can participate and grow within this brave space. And at this point in time, when meeting together is harder, I would say that we can have these conversations in a virtual environment, and they maybe are conversations that lead into what is the group going to be doing for its next season that's live? Why were those selections made? Would there be different selections if we had a conversation about the Black Lives Matter movement in our city or town at the moment? And thinking through then what would we need to do to have that conversation? And maybe you have to bring in somebody else. Maybe nobody there wants to be the person facilitating that conversation. Now, that's a resource. You can bring the resource in. It's not a good reason not to have the conversation. And so I'm going to post some articles and some ways of thinking about this, but I wanted to end this question just with a couple of, often there's sort of guidelines or ground rules for these brave space conversations, but I just wanted to give people a couple. One is that people have to know that people welcome multiple viewpoints. We often say we welcome multiple viewpoints, but do we really mean it? Own your intentions and your impacts. You may say something that hurts someone and you have to own it. And I think there's a lot said about people crying and breaking down and crying. And I think that that's often our response. And it may be, we know we've made a mistake, but we have to work through that and not let it stop the conversation. Nobody is trying to make you feel bad, but they may be recognizing that it's hard to, how could you not know this? And so, I mean, Andre said there's generations that we've been, this is a generation point in time, but for some people, if you've lived through those multiple generations, there can also be a sense of impatience. How could you not know this was happening in Canada? I know that it's not taught in schools, but are you not reading? And you have to be able to say, that's true. It's on me. I could have gone and done some reading. I could have gone and had that conversation. I could have found out more and I didn't. But now here I am. I'm in the moment and I want to go forward. And the last one I'll say is the taking risks and sort of leaning into the discomfort. Ask something about which you might not be comfortable. And maybe you preface it by saying, I'm not sure that I have the right language for this, but I've not known, nobody has ever explained to me this, whatever this might be. And that becomes an important part of the conversation. It's a risk because somebody might look at you and say, okay, I know you said you didn't know, but that is one of the most offensive things that you could possibly say to somebody. So now you know, that was the impact of it. You won't ask it in that way again, and you may have to go and do some learning. But if you don't take that risk, you won't be able to get that knowledge to enable you and your group because you may have been brave enough to ask the question, the rest of the group is learning as well. And so there's other ways you can have those conversations, but as you can see, I'm a proponent of having those brave space, difficult, courageous conversations to move any group forward, in order to be able to expand one's horizon in any field, in this case in music.
Wow, thank you so much, Leela. Would any of the panel like to reflect on anything Leela just shared? It kind of goes right into our next conversation, actually, which Frédéricka, oh, Andre, did you want to share something?
Yeah, just very briefly, I wanted to kind of reinforce and sort of bounce back some of the things that you were saying, just so I could take them in. I love, for instance, what you were saying about, I'm not sure I have the right language for this. Oh my word. That's a wonderful statement. And that's the preface that we need to challenging conversations, as opposed to, oh, I don't know, let me play devil's advocate, or, you know, some other thing before some. So I just wanted to sort of thank you for that. And just for all of the particular points regarding the brave space versus safe space arena, because once we're able to pass that on, that gets into society, that gets into soup. And, you know, and it starts to really change the nature of the conversations that we have.
Thank you so much. Floyd, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I also like to say thank you to Leela for bringing this all up. And, you know, I really, really like what you said about controversy with civility, and that we can have these difficult conversations that yes, some of the things that we say when we're talking are, you know, it's going to be, you know, controversial, but if we can continue to have that dialogue with respect, then I think that there's a lot of good that can come out of it. And, you know, this idea of brave space is new to me, and I really appreciate that this is, you know, a term that I can take forward. And, you know, I was talking to my mom, for example, about an interview that I did recently, and, you know, she's trying to explain to me something that she thought that I did not do well in the interview. And she's not quite getting to the point. She's like humming and hawing, and I'm like, Ma, just tell me what it is that you're trying to tell me. And I kind of feel like this is, you know, sort of the same thing here, is that you can just don't feel as though you have, I mean, edit. Sometimes you're going to have to edit, but don't feel as though you have to edit to the point of not having an opinion. You're welcome to come to the table and talk and have that opinion. I think it's all important and it's all valid.
Thank you so much, Floyd. Our next question, pardon me, is for Frédéricka. And Frédéricka, I'm wondering if you could share what brought you to this table.
Thank you, Nicholle. What brought me to this table? Well, Nicholle called me a few weeks ago. She sent me a text and she said, I absolutely have to talk to you. And I said, yeah, sure, let's talk. I had no idea what it was about. I was very curious. And Nicholle and I, we both studied at McGill. We both, you know, studied conducting, and you know, many years ago, and we've kept in touch. And so when the different scenarios, the different events occurred in the States and some here in Canada, a lot of people, you know, including myself and most of you here listening, where we are asking ourselves questions. We are saying, how does this, just give me a second. I've got my kids who walked in and who forgot that I'm on a Zoom call.
This is reality. We love it. I love it.
So Nicholle and I are having a discussion, and basically it revolves around a variety of different things. One of them being leadership. You know, as you know, she's the director of the choral studies at Redlands. She's the artistic director of the Phoenix Chamber Singers. And you know, earlier we talked about allyship, we talked about programming music, we talked about representation. And so the question then becomes, well, what what's next? How does this translate into my teaching life, my artistic life? How do I lead myself, my family, and the people who sing, with me? What does that look like? And I think, what does that look like? There's an easy answer to that. The real question is, I am very much interested, and I genuinely want to do this authentically and sincerely, right? We don't just simply want to hop on this allyship business and, program composers, belonging to visible minorities, or, oh, we're going to take in 6 new Black singers into this ensemble. We have a quota. It looks great on the stage when they're singing. How do we do this authentically? And so we just started having a conversation. And I think it's important to highlight this, because one of the things that we're trying to achieve through this webinar is to model how you can go back home and do this in your community. So perhaps for some of you, you're going to be the one picking up the phone and reaching out to somebody of influence, or in some cases, you may have to call the only Black person you know, right? And like Leela said, you have to have the courage, and you'll want to ask the questions, or you may reach out to members of your choir and ask a variety of questions. But the important thing is to go ahead and do that. So we had a chat, we talked, and out of speaking to one another, we realized that there were other people that we could bring into the conversation, and it just started expanding. We had our first, Zoom, and I met Leela and I met Andre, and then all of a sudden it went from 2 people having a conversation to 4 people having a conversation to 5 people having a conversation. And all of a sudden, the wealth of information that we shared, the learning that was happening, all of the different aspects of what is going on that we hadn't even considered were being laid out for us, were being displayed. And all of us found new courage. All of us found new language to be able to express certain things. And so I think it's important that those conversations happen, and to have the courage to sort of follow the steps that Leela gave us. And I think there were times where I was speaking with Nicholle, and she's courageous, risk taker, and she would say things, and sometimes she'd have the assumption that it was wrong to say. I was like, no, there's nothing wrong with saying that. This is great. And so we also have an opportunity to empower, and I think for me it also showed me, hey, there are so many different narratives happening here. Even though I am the person who belongs to a minority group, I still have something to learn. I'm still growing in my journey. I'm still taking different perspectives in. So it's not just a one-way street where, well, there's us and then there's them. It's actually, there's us, right? There's us, the choir. There's us, the board, the choir. Every organization that you belong to is an us. And then there's the us of your province, the us of our country. We're collectively working this out and trying to find meaning. And sometimes we get overwhelmed, but if you start with what you have, believe it or not, you'll end up multiplying what you have. So a conversation with 2 people, then with 4, then with 5, and today there's 38 of you listening in, and the 38 of you, you're going to go out and you're going to do the same thing. You'll have a 2-person conversation, then perhaps a 4, perhaps a 5. And Nicholle, I'd love for you to share with us a little bit how our conversations have impacted your leadership with the Phoenix Chamber Choir.
Well, as Frédéricka just shared, Fred and I have been friends for a long time, I guess over 20 years now. And when I reached out to her many weeks ago, it was really to touch base and see how she was doing, and our conversation just developed. And I think at the end of our first conversation, we said, we need more people to be able to have these conversations. How do we do that? And then we were like, okay, talk to you later. And off we went. And then a few weeks later, we were talking again and we thought, no, how do we do that? And that was part of the question of what platform do I have as a conductor to allow this conversation to be more open and more transparent to our field. And I think for me, the journey of, well, the steps really, once Fred and I talked, I went straight to Leela because I knew Leela from the University of Redlands and now she's back in Canada. And we went to Leela to say, are we using the right words? Are we saying the right things? Are we doing the right thing? And Leela, much like myself and Frédéricka, is very strong. And Leela was like, nope, that's wrong. Or yes, this is how you take. And so that was really beneficial to both Frédéricka and myself. And when we talked with Leela, Leela brought a whole new side where we went, oh, we need to talk to a composer. And then I was like, hey, wait, let's talk to Andre. So we brought Andre in and Andre said, do any of you know Floydd? And I said, oh, I worked with Floydd last year or 2 years ago at Podium in Newfoundland. And so we reached out to Floydd. And so without the quarantine and the pandemic, this conversation never would have taken place because we would have just been too busy doing other things and we would have wanted it to happen, but it couldn't. So I'm so grateful that the chain of events has allowed us to be here. I know many people who are on the call today and I want them to take mine and Frédéricka's conversation from 6 weeks ago and go find that person with whom you need to have that conversation and allow this to happen within your community. And if your community is your choir, as Leela was saying, or if it's your board or whatever the case may be, that's what I've taken from this. And I've also realized that for many years, I've perhaps out of fear done what I was supposed to do and then stuck my head in the sand. And I was afraid, as Leela was saying, to really take the risks. I thought I was, but I wasn't. And for me, this webinar is kind of the first big risk. And I don't see it as a risk. I see it as an educational opportunity for myself and for my ensemble and for my students. And I think it's a great first step for us to move forward. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in with what Fred, yeah, Leela?
Well, it's actually, and you finished up with it as well, using the term us. And I was going to say that, and I mean, this might be idealistic, but we started off saying this is a moment, but we can't let it just be a moment in time. How can we make sure we make the best use of it? And for me, I work doing human rights and equity work in a university, and I know universities have to change if we're going to meet and be the best we can for who Canada is now. And so for me, if we think about the us being Canada, then this is the time to be able to start having these conversations in order to be able to make some transformation, because and it's partly what you said, Nicholle, is there's people who are just stepping, they're just wanting to put their toes in the water because they're maybe seeing things on TV. They haven't necessarily gone on a protest, but they realize they agree with what people are protesting about, and maybe if it wasn't for COVID, they would be there. Or they're starting to do reading, and they're starting to think more, and they're starting to see that the country could move in some different ways, and that could be a great thing for all of us, and that bringing about greater equity does not mean that it's going to be, completely change everything that's happening, but also recognizing, maybe thinking about my own privilege is a good thing, because if we can have more Canadians involved in these conversations, more people part of the dialogue, what could we do if we're an okay country now? What could we do if we start doing this from the ground up and listening to what people are saying and why they're saying it, and reaching out to people who haven't come into our space that we thought was a safe space, and having the really difficult conversation of, why didn't you come to us? because sometimes that reaching to the negative can also be very informative for us. Why were we not the people you thought of? You do this work, but you never came to us. What were they thinking? And so I think we have the different, us at different levels, and we can go from that, from the two of us having a conversation out to thinking more broadly across a country, nations, and being able to think about what we could do differently. Is so exciting when we start thinking about it. And all that came from these conversations this small group began with. So I think if we can generate that sense of excitement more broadly, it will also be a positive.
Thank you. Would anybody else, would anyone else like to share? Andre or Floyd?
I just wanted to reflect back a little bit about the nature of this conversation, that some of what Leela and Fred have been speaking so eloquently about, and just sort of reinforce the vitality, the absolute vitality in reflection. I know it can often seem as if it's not enough, especially given the urgency and the pressing nature of this horrendous moment, political moment that we're in, but we have to start from some place. And my hope is that if we start with some sense of honest reflection as to who we are and how we got where we are, then the steps and responses that emerge from that are rooted in compassion, they're rooted in courage, they're rooted in more than performative allyship, but instead rooted in a real thirst for justice and recognizing that nobody benefits from white supremacy, whether it's in music or in government or in any environmental policy. Nobody benefits from white supremacy, nobody. And so if we start from recognizing kind of where we are in the scheme of that toxicity, and are able to reflect with some measure of courage on that, then the responses that the hope is that responses that come from that kind of reflection are rooted in compassion, they're rooted in courage, and they're rooted in a true desire for change.
Andre, wow, that was amazing. And it made me think, as we wait for governments to provide us with official policies for change, we ourselves are the policy changers, we're the policy makers. And as every person's heart makes the necessary choices to engage in the right conversation, also in choosing to exhibit a different type of behavior, we're actually all changing the landscape of what this country looks like. And sometimes we underestimate the power of the willfulness of an individual. What you will for yourself and how you decide to change in the way you think and in the way you act will have lasting effect on yourself and the people who surround you. So let's not underestimate the power of this reflection, the power of conversation, the power in making the types of decisions that lead us to where we want to end. And Andre, you had mentioned earlier, this has been going on for generations. This will be taking place after we are long gone. But the reason why we are important on this call is we're here in a moment in time and we have a contribution, and it's a meaningful contribution. Each of you, each of us, we have an opportunity to have a meaningful contribution in this mess.
I think before we move on with our next question, I would also like to share that in our field of choral conducting or conducting in general, many conductors don't want to be wrong. They're afraid to be wrong. They think they have to be right in order to be in charge or in control. And I couldn't disagree with that statement more. And I think the more willing conductors are to admit when they don't know something and that they need help and that there's somebody that they could reach out to and introduce to their ensemble for change, I think it needs to happen, and the time is past, but it's definitely now for sure. Floyd, your work with Ensemble Noir and the performance practice of African American spirituals is known nationally. And I'm wondering if you can help us with a path to getting rid of appropriation and instead facilitating appreciation of choral music outside the general Western traditions that we're used to. And not just for the ensemble, but also for our audience base.
Yeah, hold on one second. So yeah, I also, it's a big question, so I had to sort of prepare. Last year I started a new professional choir, and that choir is called Ensemble Noir. And it's usually made up of about 16 professional singers, so the size of the ensemble fluctuates depending on the project that we're working on. And Ensemble Noir has run into a bit of controversy in that the choir's ethnic makeup is mostly white, which is surprising for an ensemble whose name translates to Black Ensemble. And frankly, the reason why there is such a lack of diversity in the ensemble is that it's due largely to the demographic of Montreal and the shortage of classically trained BIPOC singers in the city who want to sing choral music of this ilk. In addition, when I was forming the ensemble, I was less concerned with the ethnic makeup of the group and more concerned or more focused on whether the singers were able to appreciate and invest in the music that we were going to engage in. So I didn't choose this name absent-mindedly. The name of the choir speaks to the type of music that we perform, namely music from by or about marginalized communities. So that might be BIPOC, that might be, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous people of color. So those BIPOC communities, women composers or about women, LGBTQ, or just generally disadvantaged communities. And forming a choir that sings this type of music was important to me because there are already enough choirs that are singing the music of Barber and Whitaker and Mozart, and maybe not enough professional ensembles that are dedicated to championing the music of composers and music about people of color or of other. So still, we've received a little bit of flack, quite honestly, about the ensemble, who is mostly white, singing, for example, African American spirituals, which is something that I've been focused on for a number of years now and has been the main focus as I complete my doctoral studies at McGill. And my viewpoint has always been that African American spirituals are something that should be accessible to all people. But this is the important part. People who are going to sing the spiritual or program the spiritual need to be invested in learning more about them. And I'm keenly aware about the painful and horrific circumstances that have led to this music being created. So in my opinion, there has to be a caveat attached to performing this type of music. And before I go on, I'll say that, I want to make clear that everything that I say today is based on my own opinion. I'm one authority, and there are other people that will agree with what I have to say and other people that won't agree. But I cannot and do not speak for the entire community. That said, here's a little bit more about cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is a term that has only come into common use in about the past 10 years or so. And it was only in 2017, actually, that it was added to the Oxford English Dictionary. And I would define cultural appropriation in music as the taking of non-Western and or non-white genres and performance practices in order to suit one's own artistic or economic purposes. It carries connotations of dominance and exploitation. It most often happens across racial lines and involves cultures that have been marginalized. Cultural appropriation invariably demonstrates a lack of understanding of the historically and emotionally significant elements of the minority culture. And there are tons of other definitions of cultural appropriation because it's such a complex issue. The act of cultural appropriation becomes even more harmful when the source community, i.e. the community that the culture is being taken from, is a minority group that has been historically oppressed or exploited. So I'll give you an example. there's a choir, an a cappella gospel choir in Australia called the Café at the Gate of Salvation. And this group consists mostly of white singers who perform specifically a cappella arrangements of gospel music. In addition to being a largely white ensemble, the majority of the choir also identifies as atheist. The former director of the choir clarifies that many of the singers do a sort of translation when they come across the name Jesus. They instead of thinking Jesus when they sing that, they think of freedom instead. But then in changing the sentiment of the gospel pieces and making them void of instrumentation and void of Christian ideology, one could argue that the choir is appropriating Black music, Black gospel music, and erasing parts of its cultural context. Now, the former director argues that part of the reason instrumental accompaniment is excluded from his ensemble is because in Australia, they have a hard time finding, for example, organists that are familiar with the style. He also adds that people in the choir feel that a cappella singing is more intimate and that instruments add an unnecessary theatricality, his words. However, this view of gospel music dismisses a part of the historical context, such as how instrumental and rhythmic accompaniment, as well as Christian ministry, are such an integral part of the genre. So what could they do instead? If the choir can't find adequately trained instrumentalists, maybe they need to invest in the training of instrumentalists in Sydney such that they can, perform the music as it's, perhaps meant to be performed. Or they could call the music something else. They could say that, a cappella gospel music to me is a little bit, for the most part, is a little bit of an oxymoron, to say nothing of atheist gospel music. And, or they could include on their website something that acknowledges that they're not staying absolutely true to the genre, to the gospel form, and explaining, what authority they feel that they have. So then what is cultural appreciation? Well, cultural appreciation is when you seriously and intentionally seek to learn about or explore different cultures or traditions, not for selfish reasons such as money, fame, or the Instagram photo, but simply to honor another culture. It's a cultural exchange based on mutual respect, consent, and participation, and puts you firmly in the role of student. Cultural appropriation isn't a term that's as popular as appreciation, but many of us regularly engage in this practice. We appreciate various types of music and food and fashion and visual art from around the world, and our appreciation is a direct result of the way that we connect with these foreign experiences. But the ultimate question is, how do we experience another culture without appropriating or being disrespectful? How do we culturally appreciate? So I have 9 points that I think are worth considering. The first is, know the signs of appropriation. It's not enough for you to acknowledge appropriation when somebody brings it to your attention. Somebody says, this is cultural appropriation. Oh, this is cultural appropriation? Okay, we'll stop. You have to be aware of what that is, and the only way that we can go about ending appropriation is for people to know what it looks like and to call it out and to, again, be an ally. The second thing is that you can't just give credit. Credit alone is not enough. If you want to engage in a culture that is not your own, involve people of that culture. Ask them questions, assuming that they want to participate, and invite them to share their stories and experiences. The third point is that you need to try to be woke and to be intentional. So ask yourself a few important questions. Do I grasp the significance of what I'm performing? Do I really understand the culture I'm trying to honor, or do I just have a basic knowledge of it? Am I perpetuating a stereotype that might negatively affect the musical community or the musical culture in question? And am I doing this in an effort to interact with and experience another culture, or am I doing this for a juicy bit of social media? Number 4 is, if you don't understand it, don't use it. Just as we're taught to be critically aware of the use of classical forms, techniques, and styles, we also have to be conscious of the traditional forms and practices of the music and instruments that we borrow. Number 5 is education. And it's extremely important to be aware of historical context. In my opinion, this is probably the most important point. And it's the point that, you know, if you don't understand the pain, the trauma, the triumphs, the politics, if you don't understand the social context, then you may find yourself in a bit of trouble. You know, thinking about how well you know your own culture and its relationship to other cultures and what that historical intersection means as well. You can't just read the blurb that's placed at the front of your octavo and say that you've done enough research. You have to dig in a little bit more. 6 is pay minorities for their time. This comes on the heel of the point about education. If you're going to ask a member in the culture in question to answer a question for you, to give you some advice, and you just want a 2-minute answer, fine. But if you're going to ask, you know, the person who belongs to that culture to come in for a couple of hours and workshop with your choir and share their expertise, then you probably should be paying them, and you probably should not wait for them to ask. And as an aside, if they do not want to participate in your workshop, then you just have to let that go and respect their autonomy. Number 7 is to recognize and acknowledge your relative privilege. Recognize that your community may have a greater responsibility to show deference when borrowing elements of a less affluent culture than they have when exploring yours. Number 8, consider, do your good intentions outweigh the real world consequences of performing the music of the community that has been marginalized? You know what they say about good intentions. Will your good intentioned concert ultimately cause pain, diminishment, or a feeling of disrespect to the community? If the answer is possibly yes, then you might want to rethink about how you're engaging with the music and its source community. And the final point that I'll make is that you have to recognize that, unfortunately, even if you get all of this right, you may still be accused of cultural appropriation, and that is a fact. And this is because there is seldom only one authority in a cultural community. Gaining permission from one authority does not mean that the rest of the connected communities will agree with the person that you've received permission from, or the community that you've received permission from. In addition, while you may have actively made sure that you engage in points 1 to 8, knowledge is invisible. So the person that might be thinking that you're appropriating doesn't really know what your background is, and it won't always be obvious. So you have to be prepared to solidly answer the questions around your familiarity with the material and the culture surrounding it.
Wow, thank you so much, Floyd. That was wonderful. Any of the panel, would you like to reflect on what Floyd just shared with us before we move on to some questions from the participants?
I just wanted to sort of draw a couple connections here, because Floyd, that was just tremendous. And when I think about some of these the points that you're making regarding the difference between appreciation versus appropriation, you speak of reverence and mutual respect, you speak of consent. Thank you for that. How often is it that we get to form intersectional links between the nature of consent, musical consent, and the health of our communities? Of the 9, in addition to the education point 5 that you had mentioned, one that really struck out to me was point 7, recognize your privilege, and also kind of recognize your privilege, and also your intention. Sort of it kind of comes back to the nature of grave space that Leela was speaking about, right? Sort of be, you know, sort of that even with good intentions that you may cause pain. And I like how these principles are the principles and the underlying principles that inform so much of this work and so much of this thinking and this orientation that moves us towards justice within Canadian choral music is interlinked.
I'm trying to think about how I could say this more in a coherent way, because it was just coming up for me as I was listening to Floyd. But thinking about the ways in which I think we sometimes, as we like to think of ourselves as a multicultural country, you know, officially multicultural, but we like our multiculturalism to be easy in some ways, a sort of food and fiesta, and we see people performing, and we like to see that, and we can think of ourselves as being very quote unquote tolerant. And in being multicultural in that way, big M multicultural, we're not really taught to explore and interrogate and to ask, why do you do that dance? Why do you sing that song? What's the meaning behind it? We get so used to seeing these sort of folklore days where people are up on stage, one dance per, or one song per country. And I think that as we accept that, it overrides some of the, we don't ask the questions, and we start thinking about multiculturalism versus the questions that we're moving towards, which is, how are you anti-racist? And so thinking about, Angela Davis says you can't be non-racist, you have to be anti-racist. But I think it's that you also simply can't stop at being multicultural. You can't stop at those performances. You have to sort of think about that interrogating why people are doing certain things and what it means to them. And you will bump up against the fact that some people may not want to explain it to you, and they certainly wouldn't want you performing it. But at the very least, you've learned more. And sometimes they'll be thrilled that you were asking about it. Because I was talking with my father about this, about why South Indian classical music isn't better known in the wider world. And there's many reasons, I would imagine, for that. But one of those is, that type of music. But the other is, when people think of music from India, they've got used to Bollywood, they've got used to Bhangra. That's what they know. They wouldn't even think that maybe there's Indian classical music. And so we don't ask the questions to find out the information, but somebody might equally pick up a Bhangra piece and decide to perform that without asking, well, where does that piece come from? What were its roots? What does it have to do with this, that, or the other? And so there's a lot of swirling thoughts for me about what you said, Floyd, but also how it intersects with a multiculturalism in Canada, which is just too easy for the time and place we're in now.
Fred, did you want to share anything before we move on to some questions from our participants?
I thought it was great. Thank you so much, Floyd. I really appreciated the slides that you provided us with. And even I found it really interesting when you talked about that ensemble in Australia or New Zealand, I forget, and how I was asking myself how they must have been attracted to something, right? That there was something they liked about it that was worth spending time rehearsing and gathering and singing, and they are obviously getting something out of it. Yet they're choosing to remove certain things and have decided that what they are doing can still work for them when those things are not there anymore. And that sort of tied into what Leela was saying. I mean, how is that even possible? But a great question would be to ask them, why do you think this is okay? And that would help us understand where they are coming from and why they are making the choices that they're making as well. And it also encourages me to reflect and ask, do I do that in different areas where I see something I like, and am thinking, well, I don't like this about it and I don't like that about it, but I still want to get what I want to get out of it, so we're going to change it. So it just brought me to a greater reflection about, is that something I do? And yeah, thank you.
Welcome. I think that is the point as well, is that, we don't always remember to ask that question. And I'm guilty of it as well. I program things sometimes and I think, oh, I just love this piece, I'm going to program it, and not really you know, doing the due diligence necessary to make sure that, you know, the music is being honored, and that the community is being honored. And you know, the group in Australia is, I know I read more about them, and they are the director. The reason why they started this ensemble is because they were completely enthralled with gospel music, but they you know, created a little bit of a you know, buffet in terms of how they go about performing this music. And like I said, you know, it is appropriation, and maybe that's the best music for their community, for the Australian community. But is there something that we can find within that makes sure that you're still honoring the original tradition and acknowledging it as well?
Thank you so much. I'm sure many of you who are participating now can see why we love talking to each other. It's amazing what comes out. Panel, we do have a few questions from the participants. And the first one is, how do we teach congregants to affirm and learn from Black expressions of worship? So Fred, I don't know if you want to take the lead on this one.
Sure, great question. I think a great way to go about it would be to value, to figure out what is valued in the Black expression of worship. And the things that are valued are, you know, they're how God provides, how God sustains us, how God rescues us. And because we're human beings and we can share values, then the congregants can also benefit from that. So the expression is cultural, but the content is for all. Another way would be to affirm the leaders. So if we want the congregation to respond in a certain way, then the leadership has to teach the congregation how to do so. And I think there's a difference between having people of color, Black people, singing, you know, the songs for the service, and perhaps, we'd like for you to sing something from your community, but perhaps giving them an opportunity to share in the theological content of the service, allowing them to teach the congregation. Also accepting how the music is delivered wholeheartedly without wanting it to be perhaps diluted so that it's more accessible. Also staying away from tokenism and understanding that the people that you are working with, it's a group of people that doesn't necessarily represent all Black people. So I think those are different ways for the congregants and the leadership to make the expression of Black worship more accessible to the congregants.
Thank you. Our next question is, what is the role of our choral history in schools, and how do we attempt authenticity in performance with students? So Floyd, why don't you try and help us out there?
Yeah, I mean, our choral history is pretty deeply tied to our entire history. You know, we've been communal singing since before we were taken from Africa, and you know, starting from our African melodies to the formation of spirituals thereafter, and you know, onto blues and gospel and jazz. It's all connected. So I think, you know, I do think though that authenticity is a tricky word, because it can mean so many things. But you know, let's take the spiritual. You know, I was not a slave. My parents were not slaves. My grandparents were not slaves. I should check, but I'm pretty sure that my great-grandparents weren't slaves either. So the best way to connect to something that, you know, if we're talking about the spiritual, the best way to connect with this maybe is to explore what the social ramifications, the social climate was at the time of slavery. So do some research about what life was like for slaves, what life was like on the plantations, what life was like getting, you know, up through the Underground Railroad. What was slavery like here in Canada? What was slavery like, you know, in other parts of the world as well? And then encourage your students to try to imagine what all of that might feel like if you were kidnapped from your home, if you were brought to a completely foreign land, if you were taken from your family. I think that as much empathy as you can encourage your students to find and relational moments, I think that you'll find that the music makes a lot more sense as you dig into the text that is being sung.
Thank you so much. Andre, I'm going to forward this next question to you, if you're okay with that. And it's, where can we find resources for non-idiomatic Black composers?
Yeah, that's a big question. And there are many different avenues. The internet is awesome and amazing and terrifying, and often a terrific resource for a lot of crap, but also a terrific and tremendous resource for a lot of wonderful, wonderful work. So if you find, could you repeat the question though? Because I want to sort of take it in again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Where can we find resources for non-idiomatic Black composers?
Yeah, so okay, so the first place that I would go would be the African American Art Song Alliance. That's a really good one. The National Association of Negro Musicians, also a wonderful resource. Start also with people that you know, and people that know, you know, it's like finding, it's like trying to find anything, you know, you find someone who knows somebody. And if that person doesn't know anybody, then they know somebody, because within the Black classical world, everyone is but one half step removed from everybody else. It's a very small world. And so you'll find, at least this has been my experience, that folks, that the networks are often cross in many different ways. So yeah, I mean, send me an email. And also, again, African American Art Song Alliance. And Bill Banfield, my former teacher, has a wonderful book about the chronicles African American music. The rabbit hole is not too hard to find. It just takes a little bit of digging, and often will be shaped by what it is you're interested in finding. Are you interested in particular art songs or band music? And Adolphus Hailstork may be the person for you, or H. Leslie Adams, or T.J. Anderson, or there's a whole host of resources, and there's a whole tradition and legacy of African American and Black Canadian music that extends back generations. And so, you know, just a little digging will get you a long way. A little go a long way.
Thank you so much. I just noticed in our chat, we've had 2 people share other possible links and resources as well. We have one more question, and if anybody from our participants would like to add another question, we do have a few more minutes after this one, so feel free to put it in our chat. Our last question, I'm going to point towards you, Leela, and it is, as with many groups, we see decreasing diversity as we move away from the bottom rung of organizations. How do we best affect systematic change at all levels whilst maintaining some level of organizational continuity, if that is still desired?
Yes, I think this is a question that's coming up a lot because organizations are being examined and looked at to see who is within the organization and at what levels are they. And I think there's a couple of things that happen. And if someone is taking this on, I would also say that an organization, by simply saying, we're diverse, we're inclusive, we're this, we're that, does not make it so. Someone would have to be determined that they are going to really think about who is within their organization and how they're going to progress. And so I think that, and to do that, people have to examine a couple of things. They have to look at their own biases. They have to look at, when they're bringing people into an organization, Who are they looking for? When I do workshops about hiring, I often say that when you hear people talking about fit, they use the word, will this person fit here? I always start to wonder, because what does that mean? What does fit mean? What are you imagining the culture that this person has to fit? And often it would mean, can they replicate me and others like me? It tends to be what it means. And so if you're going to think about the idea of fit, you want to simultaneously be an organization that is going to undergo systemic change, you have to think really carefully about who you are and what you are going to be doing and what your plan strategically is to be changing. But then you bring people in, but then suddenly people start leaving after 2 years. I think we often, when people leave, particularly marginalized individuals, they don't say why. They don't say because this place was racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever. They leave and they go somewhere else. And so we don't necessarily know. And several things can happen. People will look at it and say, oh, we tried hiring somebody from that particular community and obviously they didn't fit. Do we want to do that again? And they're wary about it. Rarely do people do the whole self-reflection on why would that person have left and reach out to find out exactly why it was. So people, you have to look at retention. Who do you retain? And to do this, you'd probably, if you were doing this in an organization, I would say you'd also have to do something which Canada in general is not great at doing, which is look at data of who's there, who is rising up the ladder that the person was envisioning when they said in terms of the moving away from the bottom rungs. Who is promoted? How does promotion take place? How are people mentored to be promoted? How is any of that happening within an organization? Because if that isn't all happening systemically, systematically, it's unlikely that you're changing the way the organization looks. So you're really, if you're going to do it well, you're sort of digging down at those foundations or those roots and saying, how do we bring people in here? How do we retain them? How do we promote them? Maybe we have to change our processes. Maybe we have to think about doing this in a very different way. And that's tough because then it seems like, oh, I don't know, we seem to be, our model's working quite well, except we all look exactly the same. What happens if we rock that? Will it work as well? So there's a lot that has to go into it. I don't think it worked. It's a known fact, but clearly is not necessarily absorbed that diverse groups do better work. Where you have diversity of people, of thought, opinion, perspectives, the group comes out with better products. It may take longer because you're exchanging ideas, but the product in the end will be better. But I think that is something that people don't necessarily believe because, again, going back to something that's more difficult, it might be harder because people will have longer conversations in order to make that product better. But immediately off the top of my head, I think examining one's own biases would be a start, and then really looking at who's in the organization and how people move up the organization would be a starting point.
Thank you so much, Leela. And thank you to all of our panelists and to Nicholle for facilitating this discussion today. I know for myself as a chorister and an administrator and a teacher, this has been hugely instructive. And I know that there are lots of conversations that will continue to grow out of what we started here today. So I hope that you all found this as meaningful. This session today was recorded, so we will post that recording on our YouTube in the next 24 hours, and I will send a link to that directly to all of our attendees today so that you have that. Resources from today's conversation, including the slides that Floydd created for us, will be available on our website at the link that I included in the top of the chat, where we have our bios from our presenters. And I do hope that you will consider joining us for future webinars webinars such as this, as Phoenix in particular and the choral community in general begin to look more deeply at our practice and who we affect with what we do. We hope to facilitate more of these discussions in the coming months and years as we learn together. So thank you very, very much, and we will hopefully see you all soon. Thank you.